about disabilities and the church, and with a specific focus on beyond the ramp, looking at considering accessibility in congregations. So my name is Adele Halliday. I work at the General Council Office as the Team Leader for Discipleship and Witness, and we're glad that you're here. I wonder if I can introduce my co-presenter, who is, if you've heard, is Sharon Ballantyne. So Sharon, I wonder if you could introduce yourself to the participants, please.
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Sharon Ballantyne. I'm a minister at Dunsford United, a small rural congregation about 2 hours east of Toronto. I am also a person who's really passionate about equity, and I'm just thrilled that you have joined us here tonight. We thank you for your time. We know that is precious. We also thank you for your input, and I would welcome any contact following this webinar tonight should there be items that you would like to discuss further.
Great. Thank you, Sharon, for that introduction. And thank you to those who've already been writing on the flip chart paper. Many of you have been noting where you're from. We're going to have a moment now to acknowledge the traditional territory. I'll read it from the context where I am, and when I'm finished, or perhaps during, you can, if you can write into the flip chart paper the traditional territory where you are. As we gather together, we acknowledge this sacred land. It has been the site of human activity for 15,000 years. This land is the territory of the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. The territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Confederacy of the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Today, the meeting place of Toronto is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to gather together in community on this territory. We are also mindful of broken covenants and the need to strive to make right with all our relations. If you would like, we can take a few minutes and write into the flip chart paper the traditional territory where you are. Thank you. Wanda is sharing Treaty 2. Mary has noted Treaty 6. And there are several other people who are typing at the moment. Christine has shared the unceded land of Algonquin. And a greeting from Midland. So thank you to those who have written, and you're welcome to continue to write as we go. Sharon, can we invite you to offer an opening prayer to gather us as we begin our time?
I would love to. Let us pray. Holy and infinite God, we thank you for this time together. We pray that you would open our hearts and our minds, that we might be more aware of how to better love, live, play, and work together, that all may be welcome at your table. Help us, O God, to be open to questions, to discernment, that we might use this time together to be fed mind, body, and spirit in the areas of equity and bringing all together. We ask it in Christ's mighty name. Amen.
Amen.
We're going to start with a video of the very familiar Psalm 139 as we just settle ourselves into a bit of a time of worship, that worship and work might be one for us tonight. So Christiane, if you could get that video going for us, that would be awesome.
I'll get right on that.
Works are one.
You have searched me, Lord, and you know me.
You know when I sit.
And when I rise.
You You see my thoughts.
You discern my going out and my lying down.
You are familiar with all my ways.
Before word is on my tongue.
You created must be.
You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you.
I praise you.
I praise you.
I praise you, because I am fearfully and wonderfully made.
I am fearfully and wonderfully made.
Your works are wonderful.
My frame was not hidden from you.
I made a sacred place.
When I was woven together in the depths of the earth.
You eyes on my unseen body.
My eyes are ordained for me.
All the days are ordained for me.
Were written in your book.
Before the manifold to be.
How vast are the sum of them.
Were I to count them?
Outnumber the grains of sand.
I am fearfully.
I fearfully.
I am fearfully.
I am fearfully and wonderfully made.
I'm bringing Sharon and Adele back in now, and it just takes us a moment to switch over.
We are indeed fearfully and wonderfully made. I'm going to invite us now to settle into a meditation that's called Body of God. It will also be scrolling on the screen if you prefer to follow it along on screen. You may also wish to just close your eyes and settle in. This might be a new imagining for you, but I invite you to just stay open with it. This was prepared by Becca Anderson, and she kindly gave permission to share it today. Imagine the body of God. Imagine it with all genders and races and physical descriptions of the world. God is male and female, one and both, neither and all. God is black and red and olive and tan. God has hair in long braids, slanted eyes, flat nose, big lips, long beard, curvy body, long arms, short legs. God wears flowing dresses and blue jeans, saris and turbans and tuxedos, and lots of jewelry. God has tattoos of every animal of the world, and a single heart-shaped stud in their right ear. And God has every ability and every disability in the world. God walks, God limps, God rolls, God crawls. God gets where God needs to be. God gets to us however God can. God's mind works with the speed and sometimes the randomness of ADHD. God feels pain with the depths of depression and energy like epithemia. God hears voices, the voices of all people and all living things. God has no one way of solving problems. Sometimes God moves from step to step with the most analytic of minds. Sometimes God makes great intuitive leaps that cannot be explained. Sometimes God get stuck in a loop because the present, whether good or bad, is where God lives. God paints with their feet and reads with their hands. God can dance by swaying and shuffling and sing by making noises that are not words but express emotions that words cannot. God is too busy reaching out to us to be concerned that they cannot see. God is too busy feeling rhythms of music in their bones to worry about what it sounds like. God is too busy loving with all God's rhythmic heart to be anything but grateful for the body they have. Is it any wonder that we have trouble grasping God when God's body does not move the way we expect a body would move? Is it any wonder we have trouble understanding God when God speaks with the slurred words of cerebral palsy? Is it any wonder that we cannot comprehend God who bears the chronic pain of the suffering of the world? How can we come closer to this being beyond our comprehension, this body-mind that meets not our expectations, by freeing ourselves of expectations, by searching for God in the unique body-minds of our fellow human beings, by seeking to understand that which challenges us and confuses us and frightens us, by accepting ourselves and the body-minds that make us who we are. When we pray that all of this may be so, when we pray to love all bodies and minds, when we pray to be both broken and whole at once, we are praying to be more like God.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for that reflection, Sharon, for sharing both the video and this spoken reflection. I imagine it's something that you have used before, so I wonder if you might share, how do you personally find people respond to the video and the meditation?
I have an experience with sharing both of these, actually, and personally I think people find it very powerful. And the theological perspectives are often new for some people. A lot of people do go back and look at the idea of the disabled God, which was a theological perspective originally put out by Nancy Iceland back in 1994 when she wrote a seminal book that helped people to really realize that we were yearning for a place where all might belong. In my own community of faith, I've found that people are invited through the meditation and the video and other such resources to think more outside the box, and they kind of stretch their comfort level and their learning, so it makes it really receptive. It's good to kind of think about it for yourself, and you might even want to invite deeper discussion within a group or even your whole congregation. I'm going to invite us to just kind of make some personal notes, or you can put them on the flip chart as you feel comfortable. I'm just wondering how this video and meditation resonates for you personally as you've experienced here tonight. Was it comforting or discomforting, reassuring, disturbing, new idea? Maybe you never thought about God this way. Anyway, I just invite you to take a few moments of reflection and engage with it a little bit.
Great. Thank you, Sharon. So you're welcome, participants, you're welcome to write on a notepad if you have one, or you can share your comments on the flip chart paper.
You might also think about how it might resonate in your own community of faith. If you were to share it or have these presented to you or other ideas of a similar kind of focus, how might your community of faith feel about this experience? And thinking further, I'm just going to invite you to sort of muse within yourself, why do you think that people with disabilities are so underrepresented in our communities of faith? Where are they? Why aren't they there? And another reflective point just to think about is, are you experiencing that people who are differently abled are in roles and positions of leadership within communities of faith? And is there a way to encourage that? What is your experience? So just a lot of reflection for you to think about, again, writing it either in the notes or on the flip chart according to your comfort.
We have one comment that notes that the meditation was not what we expected, but was a refreshing perspective.
Thank you.
A few more people are typing. Another note that some of our church leaders have visible and invisible disabilities, and so accessibility is a priority. An additional comment is that we found the meditation very moving. We have a few more people who are typing. Perhaps we can give a few more minutes for those comments to come up.
Absolutely. When I heard this meditation myself for the first time, I was at a workshop called Widening the Welcome, offered by the United Church of Christ in the United States. And there were probably about 40 of us in the room. And when Becca led us through it, we were all like, oh, wow, Becca, we need a copy of that. And I will let you know that you will be receiving it along with several other documents that you might be interested in following this webinar. They'll be sent out with the link to this webinar following its completion.
Great. So there's a few more comments that are appearing. One note is that we think that the meditation will be very well received by our congregation. An additional note, I really liked the meditation and the video. They were very thought-provoking. And there's at least one more person typing. Maybe just a few more minutes for those to come up. Another comment is that the video is beautifully diverse. I'm wondering about the choice to include only, quote, disabled voices, as we often group people together and separate them out.
That's a really good reflection, and one that I would encourage that if you were to share it, you might invite your congregation to perhaps be voices, to do a read-through first, and then show the video so you've got a more integrated perspective that is unique to your own congregation.
Thanks for that comment, Sharon. Is that something you've tried in your own context?
Yes, we have. Mm-hmm.
Great. There's a few more people still typing, so comments are coming. This one person notes they're happy to be here. And I think there's one more comment that's coming up, and then we can maybe shift to the next part of our conversation. Okay, so the comment is, okay, well maybe we can continue on, and if there's, oh, here it is. Our building is accessible, but the pulpit is not. I think that's the last comment for now. Is there anything you want to share about the comments that you've heard so far, Sharon?
Just thank you, everyone. I invite you to continue that contemplation and to consider where you might share that video or find others that might resonate with your communities of faith.
Great, thank you. So I think we're now ready to engage in the list of perspectives. So I wonder if we can bring that up.
Absolutely. When we're looking at people's needs, it really does often come down to perspective. We don't notice the needs that really don't impact us. So it doesn't come up on our radar. And if we don't have people with disabilities in our midst, for example, the person who can't get to the pulpit, if that's not a need, then it just doesn't occur to us. We don't think about the impacts for others unless we have to do so. And most of the accommodations that we really do need to make are not high cost. I was fortunate to work with the Reverend Bill Smith, who was the past executive secretary for my prior conference, Bay of Quine Conference. And he shared this list of perspectives that I thought was really helpful. We don't notice our smaller fonts when we can see them. We don't notice softer sounds when we can hear them. We don't notice stronger scents when we don't react to them. We don't notice the harmful, deadly effects of nuts or shellfish or other foods when we do not react to them. We do not pay attention to washrooms when they are accessible or welcoming to us. We do not recognize privilege when we are the privileged. We do not worry about stairs when they don't hamper us.
Thank you, Sharon, for offering that list. That's a great starting list. I wonder if we can offer an invitation for you all to write on the flip chart paper for more comments and to check in and see if there are any additional things that people might want to add to that list. This was a starting list with some things that we might notice or not notice based on our own needs. So if you would like, you can add some things to the flip chart paper.
Yeah, most people with disabilities, their families, their allies, are constantly advocating. And if our communities of faith can think ahead and have inclusive practices in place, the visitors or those with changing needs will be able to focus on their worship and being involved in the life, the work, the play of the community of faith more fully. So it's like they don't have to come in and look for it. If we've already thought about it, then we can make the difference. Advocacy is a lot of hard work, and individuals and families, their caregivers and allies, they're already very busy negotiating and advocating. The energy to also have to advocate to just participate in worship can feel really overwhelming. Often, possible contributions with disabilities can offer, like their time, their skills, their gifts, they're not considered. So it's one of the reasons why we often hear again and again that people, for example, can't get to that pulpit. And we don't think that people are going to have particular gifts. I happen to be a person who has no physical sight. So I'm a person who's totally blind. And you're not likely, if I was at your community of faith, to say, hey, let's invite Sharon to make a prayer shawl. that might kind of stretch your wondering because it might not make sense. But in fact, I actually love to crochet, and I am part of my community of faith prayer shawl ministry. We really find that we just don't know enough about the interests and abilities of anyone in our community of faith. And I think if you think about your own community of faith, we often discover that people don't even know that the skills they have are important. They don't realize how they might use them. Others have not known about it, so haven't asked, haven't thought about it. So sometimes people with disabilities especially find themselves not as fully active and engaged as they might be. Perhaps they've not been invited, or perhaps the brainstorming that's needed to sit down and have a chat with people to find out what their gifts are, what their leadership is. Too easily we find that people can kind of make assumptions, and when we actually have the brainstorming, like to bring a group of people together, say at fellowship time, and say, hey, what do you like to do? And just get it up on flip charts or what have you, can really energize everyone to find ways to make things work, to offer suggestions that will really benefit everyone. We all know that people like to do anything when they have a purpose and feel needed. My colleague Tom Reynolds, who did one of the earlier webinars, he has a really neat thing to think about it, that we know that as Christians we come with a sense of witness. He asks us to put an H in after the T and to be thinking about our withness, kind of that challenge to explore how we might all be together, look at those gifts and those strengths and sharing together, how we're going to, break that cult of normalcy where we look at someone and we have preconceived notions about abilities and disabilities, and really thinking about belonging. Kind of that sense of if people were missing, we would really be longing for them to be with us. When they're not there, we would miss their presence, because you may have noticed that sometimes people fade away and we don't ask after them. Too often people are just in our midst, they leave, and we don't bother to find out. It could be as simple as something like access to transportation was the barrier, which could easily be solved. Often a person with a disability who can no longer drive doesn't want to reach out and ask. They don't want to feel they're a burden or an inconvenience. So that makes it really hard sometimes. Or maybe it's just they need a companion to be with them at the community of worship, and they are afraid to ask. So we need to keep being explorers, risking our own comfort to find out what people really need.
That's great, Sharon. Thank you for sharing those thoughts and ideas. Several people have written in some perspectives around other things that we don't notice. So I wonder if we can share those. So one person has shared that I don't think we notice the complexity of vocabulary or thought if it is not an intellectual barrier. Sorry, if that is not an intellectual barrier. Another person has shared, we don't notice images without alt tags when we see pictures. Another comment, we don't notice discomfort when we are comfortable. Another comment, unfortunately, when there might be only one or two folks with specific needs, the feeling is that we don't really need to change for so few. An additional comment, I don't think we notice the challenge of sitting when it is easy for us. Another comment, it seems that our reaction to feedback about inaccessibility is to be defensive. Quote, we cannot afford a ramp, or quote, those nut bars are my best recipe, instead of just admitting I never thought about it that way. There are two more comments. One is if the pulpit is on a stage, would it be better to cut the stage out, cut out the stage and keep it all flat? And a final comment that witness, with the H, is a very useful comment. So Sharon, I wondered if you wanted to respond to any of those comments or questions that have emerged so far.
Sure, thank you. I really like the variety of lists and your very strong intuitive sense and knowledge. I can tell that you are very strong allies and people who have engaged with these kinds of experiences and noticings. And it could be a very good way to sort of come at some of the discussions in a way that we might not have thought about before. I think one of the things that we often find is it isn't really that hard to be adaptive. I know someone was commenting about just 2 or 3 people, but I think it gets even worse when people look around their community of faith and, forgive the way this will sound, we don't have anybody like that here, or we don't have anybody with those sorts of needs. And so then you're further asking the question, why? And what more can we do? And things like moving away the elevated part of the front of the church, that could be a good solution. It might be about even just moving around the congregation instead of leadership always being up on that elevated, to move down to the floor, move partway down into the worship space. I'm aware of someone who reads, for example, from where they are within the congregation because that makes most sense in their circumstance. And the community of faith is just fine with that. Often people don't have problems with those changes if they have the opportunity to just think about what makes sense.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that, Sharon. So there's been a lot of ideas shared about things that we do not notice. If we were to do some thinking ahead and do some consideration of more inclusive practices in a community of faith or ways of making communities of faith more accessible, what would be some helpful things to add there?
And I'm sure this group's going to come up with tons more than what I'm going to share here. But one of the things I want to stress as I go through some of my ideas here is you're going to notice that these don't have big dollar signs attached to them, that these are things that are not hard for any of us to adapt. Use a font large enough that all can see. So you really don't have to worry if maybe a visually impaired person comes in, they're just going to go, wow, I can see the screen. For our previous conference, we found that 40 was a minimum font to set as a standard, but depending on your worship space, go in with your projection system and play around with it. Look at it from different angles, see what your best color contrasts are. We find in the community of faith I serve that we don't put more than 4 lines of text on a PowerPoint so that it's really easy and clear, and our media booth people are fantastic to keep moving those slides along. When we're thinking about signage, it's really important to have really clear, large font, but also to have a pictorial symbol that gives direction for how to get to your washroom or other spaces. It's really important to have those signs as also for emergency exits. It's really important to use nameplates and name tags. We often have them, but may forget to wear them. Sharon,
there's just been an addition to your list, the first point where you talked about a large font enough so that people can see the 40-point font. Someone has just added on the flip chart paper to also use a high contrast background.
Yes, excellent. Yep, get a very good contrast. Thank you. It's really important to say your name and model that habit of introducing yourself. I know we often say, oh, they already know me, but everybody has lapses, and sometimes out of context. You know, when you meet someone on the street and you, oh, who are they? We all have those experiences, and we can solve a lot of mystery for people if we just get in the habit of saying our names on a regular basis. And that's especially important when we're at meetings or conferences or workshops, and particularly on conference calls. It's important to have seating arrangements where everyone can see the screen, and where there is material coming up on screen to also make sure you're being clear in reviewing it, or if that's not possible, that copies have been sent out ahead of time, for example, an agenda or items that are being discussed, because some people will need more time to process that information and may also need to put it into a more accessible format to meet their needs. When we are working together, it's important to use those sound systems. People often say, I have a big voice, I don't need that. But we don't realize that when we use a sound system, we're not only supporting those who may have hearing concerns, we're also allowing that voice to become very focused, which can be particularly helpful to those who may have learning concerns. It can draw attention when we're maybe even just feeling a little bit tired and distracted, that it gives an extra oomph for that sound to be portrayed. So we really need to use them. If possible, it's good to have hearing assist devices available in your congregation, but you also need to check and make sure they're working, and make sure that it's clear in your weekly worship that they are available, because sometimes they get stuffed in a drawer and people don't even know. And when you're thinking about seating plans, particularly in meetings, to arrange that seating so that it will benefit everyone's ability to have maximum hearing. It's really important to create a scent-free environment, and that you inform the guests, the people who are going to be coming to your meetings, of those policies, and that you really do have to reinforce it. We're seeing more and more, for example, as well, people starting to use artificial flowers to avoid those perfume scents, and inviting people not to wear perfumes or colognes, to look at their cleaning products and that sort of thing, because for some people it can cause asthmatic and even life-threatening allergic reactions. Even things like candles or smudging exercises, which are very important parts of many celebrations, that it's important to let people know if that's going to be a part so they can anticipate and plan accordingly. It's important for the participants to really be clear what they're doing through their invitations. So striving for, this is a scent-free and nut-free space as much as possible. And it may also be that we need to kind of set standards across all of our groups for people using our spaces, particularly around food, that they might bring in a list of what's in, like what the ingredients are and the products they bring in, maybe even add a recipe, because that could be really popular. We never know if people are, for example, gluten-free or lactose intolerant, vegetarian, or have those allergies, that sort of thing. And when you're arranging for catering to come in, to remember that that's a part of what you need to think about it, and bringing in your own meal, so that you also realize you want to make sure that this is safe for people as much as possible. It's really nice if you can have water available. Some other things we sometimes don't think about is something like hug, only with permission, and to really respect others' personal space. Where possible, it's really important to have a quiet space available so that folks can easily sort of have a time where they can maybe listen to the service or participate or even just take a break. Our washrooms need to be accessible, but they also need to be gender neutral. And when we're looking at the washroom space, particularly if your community of faith is looking at renovations, to really think about your design. I'm sure that if you happen to know people who use wheelchairs, they can tell you all kinds of stories where accessible didn't really mean accessible. So you need space, for example, if someone has attendant support, that they can move around the space to provide that proper assistance. We're seeing more and more service animals coming into our worship spaces and out in the community, but you may be growing in awareness as well that service animals serve many different kinds of needs, so it's really important to speak directly to the handler to find out what is best needed for that. When you're creating space, you want to make sure that a wheelchair is able to be parked in the space. There's nothing worse than going in and being shoved right at the back or set off to the side because there wasn't space for everyone to be at that table. We really want to create that welcoming that gives an emotional welcoming and that availability for everyone to truly, truly take part. We need clear, easy to understand language. I think that's one of the biggest things we can overlook is not realizing that we're speaking really fast or having a big complexity of language in our speaking. And if we take the time to think about it, then we can probably make some pretty easy adjustments that would be helpful for all. And while we're thinking about those words, we can also make sure we're checking that it has inclusive language. We need to make sure that when we're hosting events and stuff, we allow that space to speak, that everyone has an opportunity to share in whatever ways comfort for them, and that it's about both the introvert and the extrovert getting that table space, that not one voice takes over, if you know what I mean. The other thing I'd suggest is that when we're at any of our tables, whether it's in our worship sanctuary or at a meeting, who's not at the table? Who or what voices are missing? And we want to kind of think about that. And after we kind of got all this together, we want to put together some kind of code of conduct, some sort of understanding so that everybody has an awareness of what your priorities are. If you've figured out strategies and solutions, we want to share that so that everybody's using them. I know that's a really big, long list to be thinking about, but we really are always trying to aim for equity.
That's great, Sharon. Thank you for sharing that extensive list. And several people have written on the flip chart paper to add to the list or augment the list. So with reference to the 40-point font, we noted earlier the need for a high contrast background. In addition, there's been another comment around using sans serif font. So for example, Arial, Tahoma, or Verdana, that those allow for clarity. Another person has written, not having so much written in a bulletin, it may be helpful for some people. Another has written, it is important to have point people for items such as hearing assist devices. Here we have a question. So without believing that we have got it all figured out, it seems that we could make good use of a template or checklist or menu that creates some sort of quote about this event or quote about this location. That's a question for consideration. And the last comment that has appeared on the flip chart paper is that the church I'm attending is considering what being affirming means. In my belief that it is my belief that being affirming encompasses so many aspects of what being an inclusive community really means. The meditation at the beginning of this session would be very helpful for a faith community to explore when considering becoming an affirming community. So Sharon, would you like to comment on any of these comments or respond to the questions?
Thank you so much for all that awesome feedback. This is really, really good, and templates, great idea. Our points person in our congregation is twofold. The greeters have the wherewithal to direct people to our media booth, and so our media tech folks are right there before the service, so they're right ready with hearing assist should anybody ask for them. But it is about communicating so that everybody is in the know. So we have that itemized as part of our greeters email that goes out in the reminder. So it's just got part of that little checklist, but I think the template that the person was referring to would be far more extensive and would be able to incorporate a lot of things. For the person who was commenting about the Affirm, it's really interesting. Our own community of faith here just became affirming this fall, and when we were working with the folks from Affirm United, they were saying that more and more that people are really regarding it as an opportunity to look at their inclusivity. In our own congregation, our mission statement now reflects that wider, broader, inclusive focus. So that's a really great connection. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Sharon. Did you want to comment about the question around making a template or checklist or menu about events or locations?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a great idea, and I'm happy to draft some things because some things have already come up here that I think could be a good template, and Dell will speak later about the accessibility audit, but I think a template that could go around to communities of faith that they could adjust would be a really good idea too.
Excellent. Good. So there's some enthusiasm for that idea. We would love a draft template. So, so I think there's definite energy around moving forward in that direction.
Great.
So just before we started reading or sharing the notes from the flipchart paper, Sharon, you spoke about the notion that we're always trying to aim for equity. So I wonder if you can just flesh that a little bit more. So what do we mean by equity, and is it different from equality? I know sometimes in documents I've written that have been on the website, for example, people have written back and said, oh, you spelled equality wrong. You spelled it as equity. I said, no, equity. We really meant to say equity. So I wonder if you can describe, in your words, what you think equity means.
Sure. There's a lot that really could be said at length, but to put it really simply, treated equally means everyone is treated the same. Treated equitably means everyone has the same opportunity. There's an image that I think is quite popular around the topic of equity, and it should be just coming up on screen here. And I'm going to ask Adele to just describe the image and the text for those for whom that might be helpful.
Great, so there are three images. On the far left, the first image, there are three people who are watching a baseball game. The three people are of different heights, but they're all on the same size box. So the person on the far left is very tall, and the box is helpful, but it elevates their height. They can see above a fence that is there. The second person who is on a box, they're not quite as tall, but they can still see over the fence. And the last person on the right is a little shorter, and so even though they have a box, they cannot see over the fence. In the middle image, we have the same people of the same height, but the boxes have been redistributed. So the person on the left has no box, but they're tall enough that they can still see over the fence. The middle person has one box, and with the box, they're able to just see over the fence. And the person on the right has two boxes, so that's helpful, and then they can also just see over the fence. So with those two boxes, each person can see just over the fence. In the third and final image on the right, there are no boxes, but the fence is different. So rather than being a solid one with wood, it's a fence that that has holes in it, so everybody can see through the fence. And the writing under each of them, so on the far left, it says in the first image, it is assumed that everyone will benefit from the same supports. They are being treated equally. The middle one, in the second image, individuals are given different supports to make it possible for them to have equal access to the game. They are being treated equitably. And in the third image, all three can see the game without any supports or accommodations because the cause of the inequity was addressed. That is, the systemic barrier has been removed. So Sharon, would you like to comment on those images and how those relate to equity?
Sure. That image is available on the internet and will be in your package as well. And it can be a really good image to work with for folks who maybe haven't thought about the difference of creating something that's equal versus creating something more equitable. I do think it would be really great if we could have the possibility to go to the fourth view of the image where the entire fence barrier has been able to be removed. So it kind of creates that safe space that equity exists where all can take part in it, and feel that they're not going to be sort of judged. So if we go to that middle image, for example, would someone feel bad about needing the two boxes? Have we created new barriers or safety issues that we haven't thought about? Or could there be some teasing? Because we know how easily it can be that people are made fun of, or that there can be negativity, or especially those non-verbal body language communications that can say so much, sometimes being more hurtful even than words themselves. That sense of bullying and isolation that can go along with sometimes people needing some things just a bit differently. So there can be any kinds of different marginalizations that can become problematic. We want everyone fully involved. So the other piece we have to think about, though, in my example of removing the fence completely, that could work well in some situations, but we do need to continue to prioritize that sense of safe space. It's got to be fully anticipated. So there could be some places or situations where a fence is needed. So if, for example, if the people were viewing the sports game and that fence provides a physical safety protection, the chain link fence could actually be a better decision than no fence at all. So if the planners really didn't think about the multi-purpose uses of their field or access for all, they might not make the most informed decisions. So they really need to explore that. And when we are looking at our decisions, it's about trying to look at things from all kinds of different angles as well about creating that safe space.
That's great, Sharon. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. As you were speaking, a few more comments also appeared on the flip chart paper. So one references back to the earlier conversation we had about possibly making checklists about events. And the comment is, I think it would be cool to make our checklist public, which would kind of show us also a, quote, work in progress, which would say that this event hits these notes and has this amount of work still to do to become more accessible. And then the comment continues that sometimes I feel like we, me included, are a bit scared to admit how far we have to go. That's one comment. A second comment is, I have heard and witnessed myself that folks feel awkward when they are, quote, singled out in communion, when it is said, quote, let us know by raising your hand and we will come serve you in the pew, unquote. So why not serve everyone in the pew? Or maybe we could come up with other ideas. So I wonder if you wanted to comment on either of those, Sharon?
Sure. That, again, very excellent feedback. And I think we are constantly that work in process. We are all learners. We're going to continue to be those learners. So anything we're doing, we should view as it being in its draft or working document form. And the more that we share together, the more ideas we'll be able to grow and sort of support, especially those communities of faith that would, for example, really welcome a template but didn't feel they had the resources or understanding to get an initial one in place. So that could be really good. And for the sense about communion, absolutely, change it up. Don't do it all the same way all the time. In my own community of faith, we do still serve people, everyone at the pews, some of the time. Some of the time we do it by intinction and have people come up. Sometimes people do. I have my team that will go out to be the servers. We don't put up a hand. We literally, they are trained to look out into the congregation and see where there wasn't movement and then just go to those people. But we're in a small enough space that we're able to do that. That might not be a strategy in your particular community of faith. But if you think about it, there's lots of ways to discreetly do it. You could, for example, when you know it's communion, you could have people put their name into like a box or on a list at the beginning so that people would walk around and serve those people, or whatever creativity you would need to work in your own situation. It's definitely doable not to center out. Speaking of centering out, the other thing that drives me nuts is when people say things like, well, for Sharon's benefit who can't see, I'm going to make us say our names, or because so-and-so can't hear, we'll use the mic. And that's another kind of singling out that people mean in a good way, like they're trying to be inclusive, but don't realize that they've just centered you out.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Good. Thank you for sharing that, Sharon. There's a couple more comments that have been generated around communion, and a few more people are typing. The additional comments of communion is one person shared that in our church, I am asked whether I'd like to go up or be served in my seat before the service. So this might help. Plus, it's an invitation to ask if need be in the service itself. The same person went on to say, we also, every second month, we serve each other in the seats, and the next month we go up, so rotating it a bit. Another person has shared, we mostly use serving communion to the pews, as most of our people are elderly and unstable on their feet. And another person has commented, yes, I was at an event where you Sharon, you spoke to that in public, Sharon, which was excellent. More inclusive is better for everyone. That's a word of thanks to you.
Thank you.
Great. Okay, so before we started reading the notes on the flip chart paper, Sharon, you had shared a little bit more about equity and the difference between equity and equality, but you also made a brief mention of safe space. And this is something we hear a lot in communities of faith, that communities of faith can offer safe space or safer space. So I wondered if you could speak about that. What do you think is that? Do you think safe space is the right terminology? Do you think there's other terminology that might be helpful, like brave space has been emerging? So what would you note about spaces?
Sure. I think our goal is safe space, that we really are so fully integrated and inclusive in our practices, in our attitudes, and just the way we are with each other, that it feels safe. But most of us, I think, would agree that that's really more of a goal than it is a reality. And I've come to embrace for myself the idea that where we're at in that learning continuum for most of us is to be more in that brave space, meaning that we're having a webinar like this one tonight, for example, and we're bringing up questions, we're bringing up concerns and exploring So we're willing to have the conversations, get into those kinds of discussions where it is a learning edge, where we're kind of pushing the envelope a little bit and we're increasing our discomfort in order to get to a place of greater comfort. So for right now, it's brave space for me, but safe space is the journey that we're trying to get to.
Great. So there's been another comment that has appeared on the flip chart paper. This person has noted, we have hearing devices and are wheelchair accessible, so we have a sign that indicates both. This means that people are aware that there are needs that we all have to deal with, and we make large print bulletins for those we know have trouble seeing.
Very good. Signage is important because people won't know otherwise. And I would encourage you to, if you have a Facebook page or social media, to get those symbols in those places as well, on your newsletters, in your bulletin, or if you're promoting events that are happening, make sure those symbols appear there as well.
Great. So that's one. I mean, there's been lots of examples shared so far on the webinar in terms of ideas of what people could do, practical ideas that people could engage with in their communities of faith. And the ideas that have been shared are really energizing. So what's your sense, Sharon, of how we might get more people on board or make people excited about making positive changes to make spaces more and more accessible?
Sure. Well, I ask myself, where am I at? Where do I think my community of faith is at? Who might help me? We kind of have to ready ourselves to have those brave conversations. If we just stop for a minute, I'm going to ask you to grab whatever you're note-taking with again, and to just think about some sample questions here. So we're not going to do a lot, but just a little bit. But this could become a survey for discussion within your own community of faith to gather more information. And it would just be a tool. It wouldn't be a solution or a real, okay, this gives us all our information. And some people could really over or underestimate where they're at, because when we do that self-reflection, sometimes we're really hard on ourselves and sometimes we're just too easy with ourselves. So it's just a little bit of a starting point. And you may find that several people just prefer to get together and have a conversation with sort of open-ended questions and conversation. But I'm going to ask us to just kind of use a rating scale for right now to get a snapshot. So I might predict, for example, using a 1 to 10 scale, that given your presence here, you'd have a really high personal number. So how would you describe your sense of your own knowledge about disability needs in your community of faith? 1 being none, to 10 being really well informed, that you feel you'd be able to provide support and leadership. Just kind of jot your own number down there. And again, you can do it on the separate paper, or if you want to throw it on the flip chart, that's fine too. Next one. How would you describe your village of support around the topic of equity, specifically our disabilities focus in your own community of faith? 1 being you don't feel like there's any support, you're kind of isolated in this area of interest, all the way to 10 where there's a strong interest and this is important in your community of faith. Where would you score your community of faith from your perspective? Next one. If people in your community of faith rated themselves, what number do you think would be most generated by the people themselves? What number would they likely give themselves? So that's going to be a bit of an average kind of thing. And what is your perception of what the people of your community of faith would rate as their village sense? What village support would they say? Not much to, yes, we have lots of support. Again, 1 to 10. And I'm wondering, as you're doing this exercise, just kind of thinking about it, wondering if people are kind of going to think the way you're thinking, or that there could be quite a gap there. Are there any names of any people that come to your own mind that, oh, I think blank might be really interested in this topic? What would you kind of jot down? If you've got some names there that are kind of in your head of people you might invite to get involved or more involved, just kind of make a note to yourself for that. Who's likely to be part of your village to intentionally support people and prioritize that inclusive design?
Great, thank you, Sharon. So you noted inclusive design. Maybe we can come back to that concept in just a moment because there's been a few more comments on the flip chart paper. They were comments from earlier as we were still talking about the kind of practical things that people can do. So one comment is I am still working on being able to see the screen while seated. I sit on the edge of the aisle and have my feet up, so do not stand for hymns, and people standing in front of me might block the screen. The same person goes on to say, I have my own hymn book, but some prayers are not in the bulletin. Another person shares, we provide an assistive bulletin as an option. It is a, quote, complete text of the scripted parts of the service. It means more work for the presider and or administrator, but it is well used. So I wonder if you want to comment on any of those before we move on to talk a little bit more about inclusive design.
Sure, that's excellent. For the person who is seated, perhaps in a non-worship time, you could go in and sort of scout around within your worship space to see if there is a more strategic seat that could be available to you, or as was just illustrated in that last example, if it would be possible to get what I call the leader copy of the order of service, that could be available to you, that it might be easier to follow along on it as opposed to trying to see up and over the screen. But look within your community of faith and don't settle. Like, there's got to be a way to find a solution that would be more helpful to make it work for you.
Great. And there's been one more comment that greeters could be trained to know where the best seating is for individuals who do not stand.
Absolutely. It really can depend on the actual geography within your worship space and how it is designed. So individuals are probably best to make their own personal decisions, because sometimes there's a lot of complexity that goes into what may be best for someone. But certainly I think greeters being able to make recommendations, especially if your worship space is not simple in design and there could be many different options. Great suggestion.
Great. So going back to our concept of inclusive design, you had mentioned that as part of the end part of the reflection there around supporting people and prioritizing inclusive design. So the question for you, Sharon, is what do you mean by inclusive design? And is that different from universal design? That's often shared as well. So what's the difference between inclusive design and universal design?
Sure, thank you. The universal design concept, from my understanding, was largely built out of sort of the architecture world of thinking about having universal access when they're looking at buildings, and that's a really, really useful concept. And in the next Disabilities webinar, which you don't want to miss, Kathleen James Cavan will be doing that presentation about universal design next time. But I can talk a little bit more about the inclusive design. What I'm going to share with you comes from the Inclusive Design Research Center from the OCAD University in Toronto. They also created the Our Doors Are Open project, and if you've not seen that or been involved at all with it, I invite you to check out their websites and the work that they're doing, because they are very involved in this kind of work. So they define inclusive design in this way. We have defined inclusive design as design that considers the full range of human diversity with respect to ability, language, culture, gender, age, and other forms of human difference. So in your work documents that you're going to get, there will be a document for it, and the contacts for Our Doors Are Open. But basically, it's about sort of drawing things into a wider perspective, drawing that circle wider so that you're not coming up with just one solution. You're trying to recognize the varied perspectives and complexities to meet as many needs as possible in how you're approaching things. So when you sort of have a strategy, you think from other perspectives and see how that need will be met. So we've looked, for example, at the fonts on your PowerPoint, that if you're keeping it simple, those with intellectual disabilities don't have to deal with as much word complexity. The brightness and contrast could help those with vision problems, could help those with attention issues. You know, there's many, many ways. You're not just looking at one disability, for example. One solution's not going to fit everyone. So there's an intentionality to take into account all the individual needs as much as we can. We are going to fall short, but if you think about it, if you were going to create, for example, an accessible washroom using intentional design, we want the washroom to be accessible, gender neutral, family friendly. You want it to be in a location where everybody can independently get there. They need to have a barrier-free route to the washroom, and that barrier-free route needs to be reinforced by all. Don't know how many of you have had to navigate around storage heaps and other things that can clutter a hallway. It shouldn't be a dance with an obstacle course, if you get it. The signage needs to, again, be clear print with the pictorial symbols directed to and at the washroom. You need to think about what the best way to open and close a door independently is, including the swing of the door. You need to make sure that when you're creating this washroom space that it's going to accommodate like a power chair, walkers, strollers, cleaning carts. You've got to have space that a wheelchair could be parked and that transfer safely done with the space for the attendant. You need to be thinking about the appropriate safety bars. The garbage can needs to be in a place that's not going to obstruct navigation. The washroom, it would be great if it had a change table for infants and toddlers, but really maximize that space to make it as large as you possibly can, that your space will allow for. The light switch needs to be lowered so that younger people, shorter people, and those who are using wheelchairs will be able to access it. Same for the sinks, the soaps, the toilet tissue, paper towels. We need it to be reached by all. And I know when you think about it, it's like, Sharon, why would you go through such a list? you'd be surprised how many, quote, little things get overlooked when people do think they've done this great job, but they just didn't go through that mental checklist to consider it and bringing it all together. So it's really important to ask different individuals what they need. Everybody's space is different. So if you're in that fortunate position of doing a renovation to create an accessible washroom, look at your needs in that space and have those conversations. So we just don't want to assume what another person needs or that someone with a particular disability will want or need the same kind of support or in the same way as another individual who may have that same disability. We are all unique. So that's kind of how that whole inclusive design mindset is working.
That's excellent, Sharon. Thank you for that overview of inclusive design. We have about 5 minutes left for further conversation before we'll need to start moving towards an evaluation of the webinar and closing. Sharon, I wonder if you wanted to offer any last comments before we move to start closing the webinar.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. I will just remind you that you're going to be getting several documents. If you get the opportunity, please do go through them. It's really important to try to think about different people and their different disabilities. So, for example, do you know anyone with an intellectual disability? And are they involved in a community of faith? Why or why not? Or if they were to come to your community of faith on Sunday, this Sunday, what is your sense of what would be their perception of your community of faith? If we go through all those different kinds of disabilities, we can start to think about how we really are being inclusive or not, and equity really matters. We have to make the difference to be there for people and to practice that place of having a place at the table for everyone. And it's going to take work, and it's a long journey. But the more of us who are working together and feel that we've got the support, we can become our own network that's able to reach out to others.
Great. Thank you, Sharon. So we've mentioned a few times that there will be some handouts that will be coming out after the webinar, so things that will be sent to all of the participants who have signed up for this webinar. Would you like to give a brief overview of some of the handouts that people will receive? And Christiane, I wonder if we can also bring up the audit link so that people can see that as well.
Sure. A number of the things that I have shared tonight, I have put into various documents. I believe there are 10 or 11 files in all, and they summarize different things. My contact is there. There's also one reflection that I will say you may find disturbing. I was privileged and humbled to do interviews with several people during the month of January, so that's 2019 that you're going to be looking at. And I've just provided some quotes and reflections and experiences from people who live with disabilities. And I encourage you to, if you can, take time to look at that and allow it to resonate how it might impact you in your own community of faith. And I do encourage you to please contact me if you do have questions. Adele's going to talk about the accessibility audit right now. There's a more detailed audit in there as well, but it is not a template. But we'll get going on that template for sure.
So on your screen, there's a link to the audit. Oh, it's gone. Yes, it's coming back. There's a link to the accessibility audit. This is on the United Church's website. So again, it's not a template, but it offers some really practical ideas of what communities of faith could do to become more accessible. And it goes beyond physical disabilities alone, but offers a wide range of ideas and options that people could engage in. This, too, is a work in progress, so you'll note on the bottom of it, there's an email address that if you have additional thoughts, suggestions, feedback, comments, that you can write those in as well. So you'll receive the link to this as well in the email that will come out after this, after the webinar. So you can click on it, you can download it, you're welcome to use that in your community space.
The Toronto Conference took their accessibility a wonderful step further, and on their website they have information about particular communities of faith that have indicated their level of accessibility. And for those of us across different regions across Canada who are here tonight, I really encourage you to approach your region as we are in these new beginnings and see if we might encourage communities of faith to make accessibility and that kind of information, as someone said, they had symbols, for example, that information gets transmitted out there so that folks who are looking online can find out more information about what we have to offer as communities of faith.
Excellent. Thank you, Sharon. I'm going to invite Christiane to bring up the evaluation and to speak to that in just a moment. I would note, in addition to the handouts that people are going to receive after this webinar, you'll also receive a copy of the flip chart paper. Your full names will not be there. It will say participant 1, participant 2, and so on. I realize that there were some comments that have been offered in the last few minutes, and unfortunately we're not going to have time to read them all and get to respond to all of them because we're committed to close our webinar by 8:30. But once you receive the handout and the flip chart paper, please take some time to read these last comments and consider them for your own learning. So over to you, Christiane, if you can speak a little bit about the evaluation process.
Yes, thanks. By the way, I will be ending the recording very soon, and that is part of the package you get. So the flip chart's still up there, and that's up to Adele and Sharon if they want to spend some more time on that while evaluations are being written. We do have a few more minutes. What we do really appreciate, though, is finding out from you, first of all, the content, not just what actually happened tonight, but what aspects of it did you respond to? Process, especially in light of Disabilities in the Church webinars. I asked you earlier to consider how we can improve or enhance how accessible this experience is, knowing that we can't be all things for all people in any format, but that we can try to be the best we can be. It's more of moving towards that intention, as Sharon was discussing earlier. And also, the most valuable learnings. This is partly for Sharon, as she works on developing presentations that she does. For Adele, in terms of her work with Disabilities in the Church. And also just for you to affirm, hey, this was something really worthwhile. Adele, would you like to speak about the upcoming webinars briefly while folks are filling these things in?
Yes, so this webinar with Sharon's leadership was the 4th in a series called Disabilities in the Church, and there's one more webinar in the series next month that Sharon has already hinted about that's going to be led by Kathleen. And that will be a great one in April. So if you sign up for the whole series, you'll receive an email about that automatically. If not, we would encourage you to sign up and participate. It'll be another good and engaging time with lots of practical ideas and suggestions for communities of faith. So that one is challenging our notions of ableism. So you're welcome to sign up for that and look for that in mid-April. And as well, in case you've missed earlier ones in the series, the recordings of all of those are all available on United in Learning. So you can receive recordings of those and consider some of the excellent ideas that have been offered so far.
All right, and I think that I'm going to end the recording now, but the room will stay open.